Hell have no fury like a commoner scorned. Brexit and the rise of PLEBEITOCRACY. Hi Jay, I've just started. Let me first explain the term PLEBEITOCRACY, a word I created. I was trying to find a word in the dictionary that defines the lower class or representatives of the lower class and their collective voice towards a certain political outcome that was driven by their vote. To describe what happened with the British referendum, there was no word. And yet here was a situation that warranted one. A rise of symbolic power, if you will. As Steve Hilton, former Director of Strategy for David Cameron, observes, everything had become too centralised, too big, too bureaucratic, and it was time to devolve power and put power directly in people's hands. The majority of these people who directed the vote came from a class that was in revolt. This paper is divided into two halves, and for the sake of time, is a condensed version of the original. Quite condensed. The first half addresses some of the perceived visible ills that contributed to the Brexit vote. In some ways, this part of the paper is a response to Brexit's special issue in the winter 2017 edition of PSYCHOHISTORICAL, and engages in discussion primarily on immigration. I agree that immigration played a key role, but only one side was really presented in this issue, which was how steeped in xenophobia and racism Britain has become. I will address the complexities attached to the outcome of the referendum and immigration. The second half is focused on what I suggest is an unconscious motivation that drove the referendum, to the Brexit vote. I will illustrate that the vote itself was motivated by a narcissistic injury, and actually I will focus more predominantly on Nigel Farage, who I believe was kind of at the core, who was the one who primarily experienced that and kind of projected that injury onto this class in Britain. If I could define England in one word, it would be pride. There is a strong sense of pride in a country that has not forgotten the words Winston Churchill said during World War II, a war in which a large number was represented by the lower class. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. The problem is, after the war, many people in Britain weren't surviving. Educationally, financially, culturally, emotionally. But on June 23rd, 2016, these people saw victory in their hands again. I don't have time here to elaborate upon how the revolt was in some ways a response to the effects of meritocracy in the Thatcherite era. I grew up in the 70s, Martha Scargill, Neil Kinnock, the trade unions, the plight of the miners. It was the highest unemployment rate seen in decades. It was a diabolical time for the working class in that period. And then Thatcher, of course, heralding the advent of the yuppie, in the 80s, kind of added to that sort of division, between the classes, in Britain. Anyway, I will focus on immigration, for the sake of time. In her article in PSYCHOHISTORICAL, Brexit and the Rejection of Political Correctness in Immigration, Juliana Dresvina writes, "It is no secret that the issue of immigration played the key role in the Brexit campaign, referred to as an event that led to the certain upsurge in racist, xenophobic events in post-Brexit Britain. Dresvina makes the observation that in times of economic boosts, immigrants were welcomed as contributors to the nation's prosperity. However, when the Great Recession hit, immigrants were perceived as drainers of the nation's prosperity." She goes on to say, hatred of the other, racism, and scapegoating intensifies in times of economic and social instability. In this instance, true, arguments were heated, there were no filters. In England, there are rarely filters, particularly on the side of those who voted to leave the EU. As Dresvina rightfully observes, anti-Remain t-shirts and bags were made with slogans like, "We voted leave, why are you still here?" Dresvina concludes, though, that this behaviour is not that surprising because it did allow people to talk louder and freer about the issues that worry them. It is particularly true for certain classes because the permanently welfare, I quote, permanently welfare dependent, as well as the upper classes, can generally get away with anything. But in the case of pretty much everyone else, it is not permitted. Well, you can probably imagine how I felt reading this. This eruption, she goes on to say, is most probably a good sign because the fear of the other is no longer locked up and left to brew, but is being let out. Indeed, a close friend of mine, Gary Taylor-Ribol, who I grew up with, went to secondary school with, is now recently got his PhD, he's a linguist. He's lived in the suburbs of London for most of his life, and I spent a good deal of my formative years in the East End of London. I always tell my students, that, imagine a Guy Ritchie movie, I was in it. So, anyway, so he lived in the suburbs of London for most of his life, and he would agree with Dresvina, albeit in perhaps a less condescending manner. As a gay man married to an immigrant, Brexit feels like the end of all that's been fought for since the last World War. It is so much more than just leaving the EU. Labour is ineffectual and beset by its own problems, and is not putting up a proper fight against the shift to the right in the country. And the most extreme factions of the Tories, i.e. Boris, Johnson, are now the ones with the power. I'm concerned about the ideology of this latest movement. It's given extremism an acceptable face, but those on the other side are being given no say, and we now feel helpless about the future. Because of Brexit, it's okay to be a bigot. I'm very worried about the future because there's been a sharp spike in racist, homophobic, and bigoted attacks on anyone who is different. Now, of course, he comes from a minority, to begin with, and he's, struggled, in different ways. So this is just kind of an added, injury to what he's already, felt. There's another side, to this, but of course I want to give due diligence, to both sides of the issue here, not just be swayed by one, position. Alice Jorgensen, who teaches in Ireland, because a lot of the articles in the special issue were actually not from people who were English, but were Irish, Scottish, had their own gripes, with the English to begin with, right? Or American, right? So I'm here to defend. I can't. To defend a particular class. I've got a lot more. I really curbed this paper. So, Alice Jorgensen, who teaches in Ireland, seeks to explain why the people voted, the lower classes voted to leave the EU in as tactful way as she possibly could, to sort of alleviate the emotional impact that this event had on people. She describes how her friend Emma Barnard, during this time, what she voted and why. Emma is described as a working class, market town girl living in a place with few jobs, strained public services and high immigrant population. The mother of a daughter with special needs and the daughter of a father recently made redundant. That is a lot of weight on this, I would imagine a stereotypical view of what it means to be working class presented by Jorgensen here. It is telling, however, that Jorgensen's friend Emma tweeted Jorgensen her vote to leave the EU, and that she was working class. I won't vote next week with my head, as I haven't got the information I need to make such an informed decision. I guess tweets is not working. Twitter's not working, I imagine him shocked. Instead, I shall vote with my heart. An uneducated guess rather than an informed, sensible decision, close quote. You can imagine I'm reading this, all these articles. So sensible suggests that with proper education, Emma would indeed have voted to remain in the EU. Right? Like Dresvina, Jorgensen, perhaps unwittingly, is remarking from a position of academic, and dare I say it, elitist privilege. I say it as an academic speaking myself, but you know, I do not. I will put myself in that category to an extent. For Jorgensen, the Leave campaign seemed infused with suspicion of the other. You'll see this repetition of the word other. I was viscerally repelled by it. Jorgensen, who admits to liking having the ability to travel as part of her job, can afford to do so, as I can. And I understand that, and I really appreciate that, having come myself from a life of poverty. I do not know what these people's lives are, but that is where I come from. Many of the working class people of England to whom I actually relate do not have such privileges. It is a lifestyle wholly unfamiliar to them. I was raised, well, when I left home at 16, and I lived on a private airfield, and the caretaker was a man, and his wife, she was, you know, neither one of them were educated, and she had not gone 10 miles, the whole life, 10 miles outside of where she lived. This is in like the country. You have London as the city, as the hub of England, where you're going to find the most multicultural, you know, presence. But outside of London, it is a very, very different story. You don't really have cities like you do with London. You might have Birmingham, Liverpool, you know, Manchester, much smaller scale. But most of the places in England are towns and villages. You know, that is what England is outside of London. So you wonder when the vote came in, I'm going to show the you know, I can just sort of go through, you know, when you look at, in fact, I'll come to it in a second. There's, you'll see like most of the percentages that voted to leave all outside of London, except Ireland, Scotland, and London were the ones who voted to remain, because they had this strong multicultural presence, maybe because they were had afforded, you know, more education. It's definitely restricted. But unless you live and you've been raised in that country, you don't really know what it is like there. And I lived there for nearly 30 years. And I saw, you know, I was part of both sides. You know, so. Anyway, I'd like to add on the subject of Emma, that after the shock of the Brexit vote for many Remainers, Emma voiced her disappointment at being labelled a racist, because that's what she was labelled after she had made the decision to leave. There was so much anger. To which Jorgensen and her academic friends decided to moderate their language. Fear of the other is not a one-way street. There are many reasons why Brexit happened from social, cultural and political perspectives. Immigration played a key role, but not the key role. However, in relation to immigration, what were the people of Britain thinking. There does seem to be an anti-immigrant sentiment, and this sentiment is driven largely by one man, Nigel Farage. Now, I do want to show you some slides at this point. I'm sure I have time, right? What time is? Who's doing the?
I'm keeping time. You have 7 minutes.
Oh, joy.
No, you have 7 minutes before you get the 5-minute warning.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So we've got time. Let me bring this up. First of all, I want to tell you, for those who don't know, I want to show you England from the perspective of the lower classes. Very few slides, because obviously England is much more than the few slides. What do the lower classes love? Let's see.
Hi.
That's true. Let's see if it's gonna go. Or maybe it won't go. Let's see. Well, is it okay? First of all, of course, we recognise this flag, right? Yeah, exactly. The Union Jack, very precious commodity to the lower classes. I know. My husband, he hates the royal family. It is a sticking point, right? Because I was raised with the royal family. The lower classes in particular, right, are obsessed with the royal family. To such an extent, in 2002, when we had the Golden Jubilee, these are working class people. They have their tables in the street, all lined up. The flag, the celebration of their monarch. Right? I attended the Silver Jubilee in my school. We took the day to have tables lined up the same thing. We dressed in our best, clothes, waving the flags. This was in 1977, right? And you can see from the types of houses, these are just your regular people. Council flats. But they still manage, these people with no money, to pitch up tents and come together as a community to celebrate their Queen's 90th birthday. It is hard maybe to see, because here in this country you have presidents every 4 to 8 years. We have one person who reigns, and in this case since the early 1950s. There's a different sense of tradition that comes in England to which other people in other countries cannot relate, right? And of course, we like our pubs, right? Now it is in every corner. On every street, there's probably like 5 pubs, and that's it is wonderful. You don't need public transport, you can just walk from one to the other. But it's a sense of community where typically actually the lower classes, the working classes actually get, together more so, from experience, get together here. And, so it's a family. And of course, soccer. Right, Man United, Liverpool, the top rivalries, in England, it is vicious.
Better view.
My cup of tea, okay, that transcends class, I'm not going to lie. Fish and chips, however. It's bad. Fish and chips, but these are some of the English traditions that if you spoke to a sort of lower class, person, that's the first thing they would come up with. But then you have this guy. Right? Nigel Farage, leader of the United Kingdom Independent Party, who was, besides Boris Johnson, one of the prime movers and shakers that actually led to the Brexit vote. He was the representative of the masses, right? We want our country back. Now I'm going to say that from a psychoanalytic perspective, it could be translated as, I want my father back. He had a very difficult childhood, lost his father, who was an alcoholic when he was 5 years old. And I've got a whole section, on that. But you can see he's got very much some kind of, even though he went to like a private college, he didn't go to university, but I think he still kind of felt rejected by that sort of kind of the upper class, sort of elitist, where he felt he belonged. But you can tell he's appealing to the lower classes, even in terms of the metaphors that the lower classes use. Use your loaf is very much a term that the working class would hear. You wouldn't hear this in the elites, you wouldn't hear this in upper classes. Use your brain, in other words, use your loaf and vote for me. And look at him, he's very, this is actually the, of someone who's like, goes to the pub, has a pint, you know, has
Someone you'd like to have a beer with.
someone you'd like to have a beer with and joke around. Now this is the map. This is what I was telling you about the results. You know, it was the city here. We had 40% of London voting, and all the way outside of it were towns and villages who voted to leave. I won't say, but these are just sort of figures. I know I was going to put it up on the big screen, but just where most of the vote came from people who were underprivileged, people who, you know, were representing the low class and felt disenfranchised, right? But here, this, to me, and I have to admit, I feel ashamed by this image, because this was also a huge part of the campaign, the Brexit campaign, that is tied into immigration, and it looks...
Keeping them out, you mean?
Yes. He says here, we must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders. Thank you. All right. So this is him, right? And the thing is, and I know, I get that. I get that.
5 minutes.
Oh, I got it.
Oh, you doing it? Okay.
Thank you. I get that, right? So we know he's the leader of the United Kingdom Independent Party. Now this sentiment is not new. In 1968, at a Conservative Association meeting in Birmingham, Enoch Powell, Conservative politician and Minister of Health, gave his famous Rivers of Blood speech. It was anti-immigration. I get that. And may have been a contributing factor, actually, to the Conservatives being re-elected in 1970. I won't read it all as it's quite lengthy, but here's an extract. But while to the immigrant, entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different. You have to remember that England is a very, very small country. It's smaller than New York. Right? Yeah. The impact upon the existing population is very different for reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, which is now a major problem. Their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them that they were now the unwanted. They now hear that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament, a law which cannot and is not intended to operate to protect them or redress their grievances. It is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory for them their private actions. Now, from a psychoanalytical perspective, Earl Hopper explores the unconscious life of groups in terms of envy and a fear of annihilation, because that's what this is in a country so deeply rooted in this kind of tradition. In the theory of incohesion, aggregation, massification as the fourth basic assumption in the unconscious life of groups and group-like social systems, he writes that envy is a defensive or protective development against the fear of annihilation and is directed towards spoiling the resources of people who are perceived as potentially helpful, but who do not and will not actually help. So as with the image of the hordes of what look like immigrants, actually, this also reflects what French psychoanalyst Didier Anzou calls skin ego, a psychological defense shield against penetrations that endanger our integrity and self-identity. Anzou describes this protection as a containing envelope. In simpler terms, the envelope represents the maternal and the connection between the people and the earth being the mother. Some psychoanalysts, like Chachot Smurgel, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Chachot Smurgel, who wrote on Nazi nationalist ideology, interestingly, explores Walter Duray's ideas in his book, The Peasantry, Vital Source of the Nordic Race, that racist ideology is based upon the idea of symbiosis between the subject and Mother Nature, the city dwellers unable to attain the symbiosis with the mother is too far removed from nature. It is an idea found in all utopias where the city is thought to be an essentially hostile element. But I want to turn my attention to this man, Nigel Farage, a man who has experienced, I believe, a narcissistic injury in terms of a man who I propose was rejected by a class he felt right to be part of, and such defined a deeply conservative vision of a future society devoid of others. And of course, by this narcissistic injury goes a lot, a lot deeper. And I sort of touched on.
Sounds Trumpian.
And it is. And actually, Nigel Farage and Donald Trump actually get on very well together. Farage was the first person Trump met with from England, interestingly.
I think he's now a person of interest in this investigation.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. But the thing is, and I don't want to speculate. I don't want to speculate on this sort of hidden Naziology. He married a German, and he only has one testicle. I don't know. I don't want to, assume. But I do believe that with his number of insecurities, his masculinity, and his loss of his father, and the attempt to get that father back, has come back. As Freud states, and beyond the pleasure principle, and I'm closing up now, loss of love and failure leave behind a permanent injury to self-regard in the form of a narcissistic scar, reflecting the full extent to which he has been scorned.
That's right.
So Britain has been scorned, but it's through Nigel Farage that they have been scorned, through his being scorned, through his wanting his country back, wanting his father back because of his own injury.
That's good.
Freud goes on to add, a child gets, of course, the idea of a narcissistic injury through bodily loss from the experience of losing his mother's breast, for example, losses that would then feed into the castration complex when the idea of a loss has been corrected with, conceived with the male genitalia, connected with the male genitalia. Whilst Freud observes that relation to penis envy in relation to a woman, that after she's become aware of the wound to her narcissism, she develops like a scar, sense of inferiority. I would say that the same principle applies to this man.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm going to end it, I'm going to stop it right there. But this is my presentation that's going to become a paper.
We look